Welcome, everyone, to ACES, the Academy of Community Engaged Scholarship Coffee Hour, and I'm delighted to have you here with us. I am pleased to turn this over to Lou Swanson, who will be our host and moderator today.
Good morning or afternoon or anywhere in the world. Hopefully we'll have some of our international members to also view this recording. The agenda for today's presentation is simple. We're going to go through introductions. Steve will give an article overview, topic discussions, question and answer, and wrap up. But before we do that, I am going to do some brief introductions. Mary Lucy did not introduce herself, but she's Vice President of ACES. Our primary speaker is Steve Gavazzi, and for those who don't know, he's the director of CHRR and a professor in the College of Education and Human Ecology at Ohio State University. As director, he is responsible for the overall operations of CHRR, managing the center's budget, working with senior staff to ensure that resources are available, and project timeliness. Steve also has a strong interest in issues surrounding higher education, including leadership, campus community relations, and the mission of the land-grant universities. His latest book, What's Public About Public Higher Education, published in 2021 with Johns Hopkins and co-authored with Gordon Gee, was based on survey data collected by CHRR's American Population Panel. Reneé Wallace is, as she writes in her biography, has the privilege of leading two entrepreneurial entities, Doers Edge, or CEO, and FoodPLUS Detroit, she's the executive director. She served in efforts that engaged the Detroit public in informing two food systems policy changes to date, and is currently engaging the public in pilot projects to inform policy change to allow diversion of food waste for composting with a focus on community-based community systems. And the third discussion, or the third presenter and second discussant, is David Weerts. David is a professor of higher education in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, and Associate Vice Provost for Public Engagement for the University of Minnesota System. As Associate Vice Provost, he supports faculty across the University of Minnesota System as they incorporate community-engaged practices to enhance the quality and impact of their research, teaching, and service. So at this point, Steve, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lou, and thanks as well to Mary and Reneé and David for joining me, and actually for the ACES membership for joining us today. I am going to do what I hope is simply spark a conversation today by using a recent op-ed that I had written and published in Inside Higher Ed. This was back in August, late August of this year. And from there, my hope is that we will be dealing with some essential questions, essential from the standpoint of ACES membership with regards to community engaged scholarship. So just a couple of key facts about the study. First, this was a longitudinal study, although it was really longitudinal by accident. We originally had, meaning my co-author Gordon Gee, and I had originally set out to do a single survey that was part of the book that Lou had mentioned that was published by Johns Hopkins University Press. And that just so happened to have had data collected in the first 3 months of the Biden administration in March and April of 2020. However, we found out that we had some significant monies left over in a grant account that we had. And so the idea that came forward really quickly was, hey, let's repeat that study because we found some very interesting things in that initial survey. Let's see what happens 4 years later when people have the same people have the opportunity to answer the same questions. And so the second wave of data was collected in March and April of, actually, I'm sorry, this slide is incorrect. In March and April of 2021 is actually what that should say, because the election took place in 2020, and it was March and April of this year in 2025. That was the first 3 months of the Trump administration. So my apologies there with regards to that. So this is hot off the press data in terms of it being just a couple of months old. And what we did in both waves of the study was to examine citizen perceptions in the 8 most populous states in the country here in the United States. And of course, that's in order of population: California, Texas, Florida, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, and Georgia. And we added West Virginia as the 9th state because then President of West Virginia University, Gordon Gee, was claiming West Virginia as his home state. We covered a range of issues in the surveys, and perhaps for today, most importantly, we asked the single question: how citizens felt that their publicly funded universities should be spending taxpayer dollars. And the question was really, if you had $100 of public money, how would you apportion that money in terms of the amount of money that universities would spend on teaching efforts, how much they would spend on research activities, and how much money they would spend on community-involved activities as well. The other question that is important for the brief presentation I'm giving you today is that we asked people to tell us what their political affiliation was. And we asked the same question. We gave them the options: are you Democratic? Are you Republican? Are you an independent? Or are you something else? And so we asked the same questions over both of those time points. And I'll get to that, both of those items in just a second. First, most important finding is that what we saw from what people told us about that $100 that they would spend in 2021, by 2025, there was a very pronounced shift in terms of people directing more money towards both teaching and, to a slightly lesser degree, research. And because this was a zero-sum game, the money had to add up to $100. There was significantly less money that was apportioned to community-based activities. And to give you just a little flavor of what else was going on with the folks who were involved in this study, there was a pronounced movement towards what we describe as a more balanced emphasis on other higher education issues. And what I want to say here is that what we asked were questions that asked people to prioritize university activities. First one that you see on the screen is rural versus urban. So we asked people, should universities, should the publicly funded universities of your state be more involved with rural populations, more involved with urban populations, or should they be balancing their efforts? And what we saw from 2021 to 2025 was a shift towards the answer, which is more balanced. There was also already a majority of respondents who thought that it should be balanced. It was around 60%. By the time that 2025 rolled around, that moved towards over 80% of people who thought that it should be balanced. Very similar findings in terms of should universities be looking to have more of an impact locally versus an international footprint. Almost the same balance in 2021, and again, almost the same shift towards even more balance in terms of the entire sample by 2025. And then again, sorry, it's sounding like I'm a little bit of a broken record here, but we asked the same question about should universities be providing more needs-based aid to students or more merit-based aid? And again, there was already a majority that thought that the university should be emphasizing both, but by 2025, again, a super majority saying that this should be balanced. And then finally, we did ask a question about university rankings in terms of their overall importance. And in 2021, there was a slight majority, it was around 51%, who thought that it was important for the publicly funded universities of their state to be ranked highly by organizations such as U.S. News and World Report. And interestingly, no change over 4 years. Again, only a slight majority thought that that was important. Whoops. So, first of all, the beyond just the description of the items themselves, I want to point out, and again, for those of you who've read the op-ed article, you know that over 20% of the sample changed their political affiliations across the 4 years that we covered in this study, which I found to be very surprising. The literature actually says that prior to the 2024 election, what we saw was on average somewhere between 12 and 15% of the population changed their political affiliation. And so having an election in which over 20% of folks were changing that affiliation, I thought was pretty remarkable. And in fact, as we're going to see in the next slide, the changes that people made, and by the way, they were across the board. There were just as many Democrats that were changing to be independents and Republicans, and independents who became Republicans and non-affiliated, and Democrats, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there was no one shift. That the shift was pretty uniform across all different types. But these changes, when they were made, did make a significant difference. And I'm going to interpret this graph for you. The first thing that I have to ask all of you in the audience to do is to look at the bottom of this graph. And what you see are 6 categories. What I called stable Republicans, which meant people who were Republican 2021. They were also saying that they were Republican in 2024. And then the changed Republicans, that meant that they were something else before 2024, and now they are Republicans. And then you can interpret the rest. The changed non-aligned, which meant they were either Democrats or Republicans or independents, and they became non-aligned, versus those people who were non-aligned across those 4 years. And then finally, the last 2 categories, people who were something else and became Democrats in the 2024 election, and those that were stable as Democrats across those 4 years. Okay, so why the circles? Each of the group members inside of these circles were the same statistically. So what this meant was, and let's look at the top of the graph. Oh, I'm sorry, I better explain the y-axis here. So that was the x-axis. The y-axis is the amount of change that was reported in terms of more money given towards teaching. Okay, so the top 2 groups that were saying we really need to spend a lot more money on teaching were those people who had been Republicans across 4 years and those people who became Democrats in the 2024 election. That was pretty shocking to me. The second group that are all the same is the people who became Republicans, the people who, and then both groups of the non-aligned. And then finally, the last group, it's not a group, it's just the single data point, was the stable Democrats. And if you will notice, that stable Democrat number is below 0, which meant that the stable Democrats were the only group that was saying we should be giving more money to research or community involvement and not teaching. That was the only group out of the 6. So I am not a political scientist. I cannot interpret this any more than what you see on the graph. But what I can see in terms of the 2 key takeaways from the study that I bring to today's conversation is, first of all, cross-sectional studies really do leave us blind to individual level changes. And this is not going to be an exercise in beating up on cross-sectional studies. They absolutely have their place. But, okay, you're going to allow Steve Gavazzi to get up on his soapbox for just about 30 seconds here. The fact of the matter is Gallup and Pew, which are the two biggest organizations that are always telling us about, and look at the screen with my bunny ears, the quotes here, that we're seeing change in the electorate, they do not do longitudinal research. And so the changes that they're seeing really can be noise. There's just as much evidence that there is noise in their findings as there is that they're actually documenting actual change. So again, the difference here is we asked the same people the same questions, and we got some really different responses. And again, the other problem here is when you think about what Gallup and Pew do, they always tell you about what Republicans or Democrats are saying. Well, if over 20% of the groups are changing their political affiliations, that introduces a lot more noise into the claims that they're making about the surveys that they're conducting. And then the second key point, and it's really more of a general one that I hope to touch on, at least I hope it gets touched on in our discussion today, which is what it says on your screen here about universities ignoring public opinion at their own peril. I just really think that we have unfortunately been tone deaf to a lot of what the public has been trying to tell us over the years. And I really do think that that the findings that I presented briefly for you today really underscore that. And don't believe just me. Let's go back to one of, if not the greatest presidents of all time, Abraham Lincoln, who said, public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail, and without it, nothing can succeed. Thank you for listening to me, and Lou, I'm tossing it to you.
So thanks, Steve. So the way this the remainder of the webinar is going to be structured is that we have three discussion topics that we're going to have a brief discussion of. And for each one, I'm going to invite Reneé and David to give their comments, at the end of which we will have our question and answer period. So Reneé, I'm going to continue to go alphabetically. If you could start, and then David, I will ask you to follow. The first one is the role of technology, of teaching and research and community engagement. And you can read the two bullet points.
Yeah, so happy to be here, everyone. Glad that you could join us on today. So I would say on the first one, and I can't speak broadly, I can speak from just the standpoint of my own experience around why we may have seen, some emphasis around teaching and research over engagement. When you think about value that an organization can bring, I kind of think about it in sequence. My answer to this will be more of in sequence, that the value of the learning that happens, the exchange between teaching and learning that happens, and the value that you get from research is a big outcome from the work at the university level. There's an expectation around some engagement, right? But the bigger value is, at least I found this over the years of being engaged on both sides, that the kind of learning that happens and the research with it being gathered from various different communities, you're going to get deeper information than you might be able to get on your own. And when you then engage with people in community, you have more value even to bring to help shed light on what's going on. Might be a reason why people might have thought that they would prioritize, teaching and research over engagement. That's not to say we should not do engagement. I'm a huge proponent of engagement, joining the genius of what happens in the academies with the genius and community to help address the challenges that we all face, because we all live in community. When we think about how do those of us who practice community engaged scholarship begin to elevate teaching's mission and demonstrating, I think it happens with those exchanges around what is it that we really feel like we need to know. What is it that we need to understand about what's happening in the world around us? And how do we demonstrate that as people learn about those things, that they actually become more informed as citizens? You don't stay in the university forever. The students eventually go home somewhere and do things. And so the things that they learn, I believe, are going to equip them for the way they function as citizens, in our communities. So if we can help both understand that, both folks in our community, as well as the expectation that we're not learning just for learning's sake, we're learning to go and be highly informed, citizens and active citizens.
Okay, David?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to, I really appreciate Renee's comments, and I think we have a lot of similarities in how we think about this. So one of the things around the first question about why does the public continue to prioritize teaching and research over community engagement? One of the things I think about, even from my own research I've done over the years, is that the public tends to situate their understanding of the university through their own experience. For example, in college, or the neighbor boy or girl who went to college. And so the value proposition heavily weighs on personal benefits and how people are thinking about that. Even legislators, when they are called, a lot of times it's around concerned constituents, around things that they're kind of thinking about in that domain. And as regarding research, maybe similar to Renee on this, one of the things I think about in terms of the investment or attention is that we often link this to, for good reasons, around innovation and national prosperity and security, which are things that are easier to measure in terms of university impact in this area. For example, you can count the number of patents and startup companies and track stories about how research in technology transfer has gone into places to innovate new companies or technologies. But I think, community engagement, we've always kind of had the struggle in the sense of these are very complex kind of, open entities in that there are a lot of things that are going on in communities for which universities support and involve their knowledge and collaboration with communities, how else they may not see the overall impacts of that in a way that's easy to measure. I'm thinking about my economist when I was at the University of Wisconsin, who always said, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And I think some of these community outcomes are harder maybe to track, and there's a lot of things that impact that. So it becomes a harder thing for people to message around. The second question about how community engaged scholarship elevates the teaching in mission and public value. One of the things I think is interesting is actually that the good news is that the demand is there. So we do our own surveys of University of Minnesota students show that about 90% of our students want to do this community engaged work and have a learning experience in this way. But often, sometimes this is seen as a periphery and not central to the learning experience itself. So, for example, we know that these kind of practices are considered high impact practices, and they make teaching better. But sometimes we think about these as separate entities than actually strategy to actually create better teaching and learning itself. So that becomes almost a siloed different experience than actually a way to do great teaching. So I think some of those things are on us a little bit, that of how do we tell the story a little bit better around doing this work in a different way that actually improves the outcomes of teaching and learning. But it's a strategy, not a standalone. So those are a couple of things I thought about.
Okay. The second topic discussion is public trust and institutional relevance. And again, you can read the 2 bullet points to guide. And this time I'm going to ask David to go first and Renee second.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting, this is the erosion of public trust question. So I think a couple things, when I looked at some of the national data around a couple of the main issues around public trust really go to that first question we answered before of how people frame this as more of a, undergraduate teaching and learning experience, where people are really concerned about affordability. And so the most of the things I'm reading around is that there's a unifying theme across party lines is the nervousness about costs. Is there a return on investment? And people are worried about these kind of things in terms of how much investment or their own kids' education. So there's that. And then I think there is this whole issue around politics, and Steve's work is really interesting to help us think more nuanced. I was recently at an institution that was looking at the future of their service learning and broadly community engaged learning programs. And they were thinking about how to bring a bigger tent perspective to this work because of concerns about that. How this work was framed was maybe catered to certain kind of ideological thinking and those kind of things. So I think those things have contributed to some public trust kind of issue. And so the second thing, I'm answering the second one too, right? Real quickly. So that one is. How can universities better align their missions with the needs and expectations? So I think here's also another challenge. It feels that needs and expectations are in the eye of the beholder, in the sense that these can be highly contested areas about what the actual needs are and our approach and how we even frame the issues. So one thing I think of real quickly around this is that some of the work we do in communities might have more agreement around the root causes of challenges we have in a community. So you might have like a technical fix to something. An example would would be, we're seeing here that people understand that nitrates in farmland cause water pollution and is something to work on. So people are working across sectors to address that. But a more complex issue where the causes are contested are things like crime in our neighborhoods. And I think understanding that people come even to different understandings about justice through various justice traditions and views of the world. I think those are the things that our mission as teaching and learning institutions can really bring people together to say, how do people understand these very complex problems from very different worldviews and ways that we think about society and even questions about what it means to be human. So I think those kind of things we can live into our mission to say, can we work in a way that the university can work across, in many cases, profound moral disagreement around questions that I mentioned around crime or whatever it might be, so that we can get to the common good. And I think we've got work to do in that area. So those are a couple of things that come to mind.
Thanks, David. Renee?
Yes, these are pretty important topics, I would say. When you think about things that contribute to a lack of trust, some of the things that people talk about is the nature in which the interactions occur. If people feel that the information or exchange is extractive or uh, it exploits people's voices and their resources and their thoughts in a way that data is gathered with presumptions about even the community itself, gathered in ways that is only used for the purpose of, academic outcomes. People need to graduate, you got to write papers, you got to do research, that kind of thing, without maybe consideration for the use of the information by community as well. People spending their time and giving information about their experiences and it being primarily one way in terms of the use of it, even the formats and ways in which information is gathered. So when it feels all one way and people feel it's extractive in nature and it exploits people and their voices and their resources, that can lead to mistrust when there's not a belief that there's some value and benefit to you, in an exchange, in a process. So it's not really an exchange. Another is when the cost of being engaged with university and community. For example, on research projects, there's typically a lot of funding in the projects for the researchers and for the students who are working to get degrees, but there's not much funding, and so it covers their cost of being engaged. But when you look on the other side with the community, there's very little resource available, even though their time is valuable, the time is needed to participate, but the allocation of resources for that participation is not equitable. You get a college student's tuition paid and toward housing and other things, and you pay stipends, and stipends are paid to people in community. So that sense of not being valued creates, some distrust. Another is just how the information is even relayed back. Does it accurately reflect what's really going on in the community? Is it selective in its nature of what's reported? Is it through a biased lens in terms of what people have assumed or presumed and said versus what actually is happening? So those things over time have contributed a lot to distrust, and those are things that have to be overcome when we're talking about being really able to leverage the benefits that come from the work that happens in our academies. So what do we do to better align around our missions? One is, don't believe everything you read about places. Go and see for yourself. I happen to live in Detroit, and you can hear all kind of narratives. I've lived here since I was 22 years old. I'm 69 now, and a lot of stuff I read, I'm like, where is that happening? So you need to find out for yourself, and don't believe that the things that you read are like a blanket thing that applies to everything, everybody, everywhere in a particular community. So when you're looking to create some alignment, you look at whatever that area is that you're working on, and how does that align with what's actually happening in a place, where you're going to go and engage, and how do you make sure that what you're addressing addresses both sets of needs. I do system process change work for a living, so being able to integrate across different perspectives is critically important to doing that kind of work. So I've just learned over time that you have to spend the time to understand both organizations, why they work the way they do, how things are organized, how things actually happen in real time, what's important, and determine how do you meet the needs of both, in the very design and the way that you approach what it is that you're doing. So I think that, while some of it is broad in terms of alignment, I also think some of it is hyper local. You have to get down to, who you're working with and for, and make sure that, what you're doing is going to align at that local level, as well as, at a higher systems level.
Okay. Thank you, Renee. Actually, you have started answering the third discussion topic, which is listening as leadership. So I'm going to start with you and then go to David.
Yeah, so listening is huge. Listening to me first starts with an act of two things, love and humility. When you have a regard for another and you will consider them in their humanity, it affects the way you listen. When I often ask my friends in the academy, are you doctor at home? Are you doctor in your community? So I think sometimes we forget that our leaders in our academies are community folks also. We live places. You all live places, right? So I think sometimes we have to listen first through our humanity and with some humility, that the things that you know and the things that people who know from living are all very valuable. It's valuable to know life through experience. It's also valuable to know life through the things we learn in classrooms, because in most cases it's based on some experience from somewhere. So I think we have to really learn how to listen. Sometimes being able to set aside, not sometimes, but being able to set aside presumptions of what you may think, you know, and leave room for the fact that there's a lot that you don't know. So being open to consider things that you hear and to be willing to even change a perspective based upon the things that we do listen, that you do hear. So being able to design engagements in such a way that they really do start with listening before, telling and sharing. Um, so I would say that in response to the first question. And when we think about how do we translate public feedback, into action, being able to look at the areas that people point out that have a need for change and determining what are the real things that you can do that actually are actions that matter. You can look at the feedback around the use of research and data and things of that nature as an example. And I understand that sometimes there are barriers like, requirements and things that have to be met. Well, you may have to make some changes internally in order to be able to actually, respond to some feedback, that you get. And those may be hard changes to make, but being willing to make them, the effort to make them, to have an authentic, attempt to facilitate, some of the change. So when we look at who we are, those of us who are engaged in, community engaged scholarship, whether you're in the academy or not, it's really helping, to make a direct line between the feedback and the real kinds of institutional actions that will reflect that that change, was attempted or made.
Thank you, Renee. David.
Yes, real quickly here, because we're leaving time for discussion and questions. One of the things I was thinking about, especially related to Steve's opening comments, is it really showed us that public opinion can sometimes be a blunt scale or instrument if we're not nuanced in how we do that, and collect the data and analyze it. And I've always kind of thought about related to how Steve is thinking about belief systems as ways to segment and more deeply understand who is in our community. Because when we think about listening to public opinion, sometimes we have proxies for what these things might be by, identity groups and things like that, which have a relationship to worldviews and these ways of thinking, but I feel like they're inaccurate. So for an example of that is, if you were to look at Steve's data, how are different communities framing problems in different ways? And maybe our role then for listening is how do we bring together profound moral disagreement around these particular issues and even how we're engaging in communities, um, and thinking about how we understand really kind of quote unquote public opinion through these nuanced and complex belief systems. So I feel like continued sophisticated ways of understanding that and engaging would really be helpful for our institutional listening. And then the last question, how community engagement professionals help translate public feedback into action. I think, again, it comes back to maybe a continuum of complexity of community issues around the scale. So the things are maybe more technically fixed, if you want to use that term, but that the root causes are in more agreement, that the universities would apply resources that provides a tangible benefit to address a specific issue. So for example, here in Minnesota, maybe other places elsewhere, we're looking at the quality of our water and some of the habitat for ducks and all of that where people are in agreement on. But then there's these other complex spaces where root causes are contested. And I feel like the role of the university in engagement, we could do more is convene diverse knowledge holders, and even if you're open to the idea of diverse wisdom traditions, and even the way Reneé was talking about love and humility comes out of a certain tradition of thinking, the Martin Luther King and associated, and how we think well together across disagreement. I feel like the time is now to do that in ways that we could apply our commitments in that way. So those are just some things in that regard. So thank you.
Thanks, David. So we're entering the question and answer period, but the first voice is going to be Steve's. Steve, you've had an opportunity to listen to both Reneé and David respond to questions and issues that you laid out for this webinar. So I'm handing it back over to you, Steve.
All right. Well, I am grateful for about 5 pages of notes. First of all, so thank you. I don't know if anyone else got anything out of this discussion, but I sure did. Fantastic and wide-ranging responses. So just thank you so much, Reneé and David, for that. And I'm really looking forward to the rest of today. I'm glad we have almost 20 minutes to talk. So I'm going to keep my remarks brief so that we can hear from people's voices that we haven't yet heard today. But I will say that I'm struck with the variety of different ways that we can approach this topic. And so I don't think that there's any one right way to proceed here. I think that a lot of what we perhaps are beginning to discover, as I think David so eloquently put it at the end of his remarks, there's just as much commonality as there are differences. And I think part of what we really need to be careful about is how we ask questions. So I think I'm going to leave it there, other than to say that I'm inspired to now not only do a third wave of data collection to see where things go, but I want to also point out that I did have several partners here on campus who urged me to add some new questions. And the next part of our scholarship that we'll be doing with this data is looking at how this longitudinal data predicts some of the new items that we have asked. And central in those questions is trust in universities. And so we have a number of questions, one which is just an overall trust question, and then trust about providing a good education, trust in conducting highly reliable and valid research, providing the education to become good citizens, and then finally the last question is about providing an education that is free of political violence. So stay tuned. We're going to be analyzing that data and looking at how this longitudinal data predicts these trust variables. So with that, thank you, Lou, for that extra opportunity, but I want to hear from other people.
And so do we all. So there are 2 ways that you can ask a question. You can either put your hand up or the little yellow hand, or you can put it in the chat. And we have 2 chat statements. They're not questions. One from Jim Waddell and a follow-up from Mary. So at this point, I want to give everyone an opportunity to engage Reneé and David as well as Steve on their comments, and feel free, as both Jim and Mary have already done, make some statements. From this group is not that quiet.
Well, Lou, I'll jump in. Thank you all. Steve, this is fantastic. And David and Reneé, terrific responses. I'm writing myself, Steve, and I do see you have your The Ohio State University shirt on. So we got it. We got that number 1. Before I came into this meeting, I was in a meeting about the future of our PhD program. And it really gets to something that we talked about in the first set of questions, and that is how community engagement scholarships inform all of this. So if you'll bear with me here, this intersection of lack of trust, kind of believing that higher education doesn't have a real role or the role is diminished. And then this idea of that research, new research, creative research is not needed, flies in the face, it seems to me, Steve, you're full screen, of the mounting problems, generational problems that we have. So it seems like we're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Or is the issue, back to another one of the questions, simply public will to solve the problem? So that's like 5 questions in one. But the idea is, who do people think are going to address these issues if we're not listening to the public? So let me just stop there. And
Steve, you want to give a quick response?
Is that directed towards me?
Yeah, you're the only Steve, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear Steve. So, yeah, I mean, again, my mind is going much far faster than my mouth can keep up with. But I think that the central piece I take out of that is the who question. Who's going to do this? And this gets back to some of the writing that Lou and Roger and Scott had provoked me to do. I think it was 2 years ago now, in the special issue that focused on the role of extension. And, you know, we've assigned primary responsibility, at least in land-grant universities, to extension as being the who that's going to take care of the what, in this case, the community activities. And yet we continue to see how land-grant universities struggle structurally to handle that, because all too often extension remains inside of the traditional College of Agriculture. And therefore it remains embedded in, right or wrong, a viewpoint that is largely rurally based. And the question actually that we had asked in our survey about rural versus urban really in some ways got at that. It was an attempt to say, you know, what should the university be doing? I will tell you that there is no surprise that the people who did not say that things should be balanced, if they said that it should be more in a rural focus, they were from more rural areas, because we have that information. So, you know, and the same thing is true of the very few people. There were actually very few who said that it should be urban based. But they were, those who said that were living in an urban area. So self-interest is always a primary motivator. But saying that, the fact that over 80% of people said it should be both, when the vast majority of the continental United States is living in a more urbanized area, speaks volumes about the desire to see a balance. And yet, unfortunately, I think that the structure of extension hasn't kept up with that. All right, I'm off my soapbox now.
Okay, well, I'm going to put Cathay onto her soapbox. Cathay?
Yeah, I'm trying. There we go. Well, good morning. First of all, I guess it's morning. Yeah, it's still in my morning. I want to go live with Reneé if I can. I'd love to work with Reneé. I think I'm not quite in 5 pages, Steve, but I have a few pages here of notes. One of the things I think that I've been really blessed with is our extension is not in the College of Ag, it's across the colleges, and that's such a blessing to the community because they don't see just one college in their community. But having been on both sides of a community and an elected official spot and then in the college, one thing I think that's difficult, and it's kind of a Gordian knot, and it was in the first question, which is how do you really explain the value of community engagement when you're in a community, you're trying to be part of a community and not take whole credit for the outcome. It's a dichotomy that I think everybody, it's not just universities, but a lot of organizations they try to be very under the radar about the skill they have because they want to be a community partner. And it's a hard show at the end. The second part of that, and I have so many notes on your 3, but one of the last questions was, how do you show that what you've taken from your community in their input and your partnership actually has some impact at the university? And I think Reneé touched on the feedback loop, which is you spend time in a community, you listen to them, and then you may take it back, and you have to have an institution that's willing to listen to the work you've done. And then don't miss the step of going back to your community and saying, we did it. Because if you start in a community and you work and you create these very hard partnerships, and then you go fix it, but you don't tell them, they don't see the value in their investment. And Reneé, you're right about, you give gift cards, you give a little token travel for the community. Their biggest honor is that you've taken their information and you've taken it back and you've done something with them. That's of a great deal of value to a community, and it's a great deal of value in building that trust. So I have 20 other answers to other questions, but this has been fascinating. Thank you. Call me when you want some help, Reneé. I'd love to be in your group.
Yeah, actually, I would love for Reneé and Cathay, who I worked with and helped me flip extension and create engagement at Colorado State University. The two of you in a room, I wouldn't give you any alcohol. I think it would be so energetic. I don't see any hands up, but what I think might be helpful, since we've heard from both Jim as well as Roger in terms of statements, if you would like to elaborate on your statements in the limited amount of time we still have left.
I'll jump in. Okay. The statement that I made was just while David was presenting and bringing up the idea that a lot of the things that people talk about with regard to value of our institutions ends up being about these economic kinds of things like tech transfer and so forth. The fact of the matter is that there is a lot of community engagement, believe it or not, that happens around things like technology transfer and other economic development efforts that universities get involved in. But the people who work in those areas, I'm about to go to a conference next weekend of the University Economic Development Association. They don't know how to talk about the community development that they're doing and the community engagement. They don't have that language. So people who know about community engagement need to be connecting with the economic development folks. They are doing community engagement. They are listening to the needs. Sometimes the community is business and industry, yes, but a lot of times it's people in neighborhoods who are being affected by these economic policies or economic decisions. So we need to do a better job of tying the economic engagement story to the community engagement story, which there's a lot there to do. I mean, a lot of it is there. And the other comment I made just quickly was somebody was just talking about how challenging it is I think it was Cathay just mentioning that, we don't want to tell this story and take credit for things when it was, it's at least half of that job is the community, and the community did at least half of this work. So my feeling is, let the community tell the story then, and we don't have to take the credit. We don't have to always talk about the wonderful things we're doing as universities as proof points and patting ourselves on the back. We can talk about how great the community is and how honored the institution is to be part of that, right? It's just a little bit of a flipping of a switch in terms of how we do that storytelling.
Roger?
Yeah, maybe I just watch too much college football on Saturday, but I always get frustrated, when I watch those little 30-second the snippets about the universities, that are playing in that particular athletic event, and more often than not, what you see, and I mentioned this in the chat, is that you see people with white coats and test tubes, and you see students sitting in classes or something like that. I have yet to see, and maybe I'm just watching the wrong universities, but I've yet to see really a deep feature on what those universities are doing, how they're community engaged and working in communities to solve problems. And I don't know if that really goes back, and I think, Jim, you said it as well, is that we really don't even know how to package the words in a way that people understand that what community engagement is. We have such a broad set of definitions for what falls into that category. I'm not sure we even do a good job of defining it well, even among ourselves, let alone to the public. So I think it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, if these are the things that we continue to show that universities do, people don't really understand that this community engagement work, you know, is even on the menu. So I think that's a piece of it as well. And I'll leave it at that.
So a quick follow-up to what all of you have said is that this is a recording that will be putting out onto our new YouTube channel. We need to get this discussion out as well. I mean, this is one of the issues that those of you who are a member of the ACES board knows that it's very high. And as a relatively new ACES member, I see an organization that's really trying to step out into public sphere and open up the expertise that we have. So as we go into, that's my two comments for today. As we go into the last minute or so, first of all, if time runs out, I want to thank Reneé and David for fabulous follow-up and staying on target. That was really good. And Steve, I hopefully we'll have another coffee hour. We've discussed one. Maybe this will be a chance to expand these discussions. So does anybody have any last comments? Maybe Suzanne, you usually have some really good ones.
Well, I would just thank everyone. This is exactly the kind of conversation we need to have. And I think just building on Roger's last comments, words are everything in packaging, and how can we, and then Jim jumped in on the chat and said, it's not just how we describe it, but what the outcomes are. That's a intersection of that conversation, I think, gives us lots of things to think about and talk about. But thank you so much, Lou. Great job, and Mary. Thank you.
And Steve, do you want to have any concluding remarks?
Okay, well, I originally pushed back when you said this should be a two-parter. I said, let's see how the first one goes. So I'm now going to say, Lou, I think that we have the evidence that this is a really important topic. And so I would be willing to do a second round of this. And perhaps it should be focused on the other part of what I had described, which is we are going through the trust data right now. And even before I didn't realize that people were already using the word trust in the chat before I got done with my remarks, and then I started reading through. I think trust is a very salient issue here, and whether it's trust in the workplace or trust in medical settings or trust in any of the other things that all too often we don't think of as community, I think that is a topic that's ripe for more discussion. So I'm on board, Lou. If you want to have another one, I'm definitely on board.
Any final comments? We still have a minute or so before Mary closes us off.
I just want to say I always appreciate these conversations. It's good to know that we're digging in here. I'm probably going to align a bit with Jim that, you know, the language will come as we start to do the things that we want to do. I think that alignment around what we want to do is absolutely critical. I don't care if we call it whatever. It's that alignment between there's genius in the academy, there's genius in the community. We all live in community, and we want to bring these resources and thoughts and ideas together in effective ways. We can call it community engagement. That's beautiful. I think if we keep our eye on the actual thing we want is what's really going to be the most important.
David, I would like for you to give one short response.
Okay, my very short response. Thank you for that. I think even the notion, Reneé, of what we want, one of the things I'm thinking about in this moment in our society is whose vision of society, of the good life or the good society, are we engaging around this? And I think this is a question of our time. And so what are the ultimate ends of our engagement work around society that's going in directions for which there feels few resources to bring us together? And I think that feels like something that we should turn our attention to. So hopefully that was short enough, Lou.
Oh, no, it was excellent. Great wrap up. So I'm going to hand this back to Mary, who is actually running the show.
Thank you all so much. And we definitely look forward to further discussions And we encourage you, if you have questions, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll have the ability to see how to contact our presenters. If you're an ACES member, we encourage you to jump into the dialogue. I want everyone have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.